Hey guys, sorry I can't be there in person, but the Jewish holiday of Passover has kept me preoccupied, but I don't want to deny you one last chance to see me. Some of you might be happy about this, some of you might not. My subject that I studied in this class was debt peonage. It's not a very well-known subject. In fact, most people, even who are familiar with Reconstruction and the Civil War on some basic level, have never heard of debt peonage. They might have heard of the convict leasing system, which I'll mention momentarily, but they've never heard of debt peonage, or if they did, they forgot about it because it's so vaguely mentioned. What was debt peonage? Well, the title is actually a little misleading. Debt peonage would seem to imply, which was a practice known since the times of the Greeks, that a person owes money and you make them work it off through labor. But in the South, unfortunately, especially in the period that I studied, which was 1865 to 1914, the South was still very racist and still very prejudiced. They had a belief that all black people were meant to be second-class citizens at best, and almost slaves is what they like to keep them as in the worst form. And therefore, they reorganized their debt peonage system, which they had even before the Civil War. But they reorganized it to focus solely, or not completely, but I would say 90% on black people. If you would read the material in depth, you would see that they also took advantage of immigrants looking for work, and they forced them into this system as well. But my focus was on African Americans. I first want to discuss the primary sources and secondary sources I used. The primary sources that I used for my project were the peonage files of the U.S. Department of Justice. I believe I printed out a copy for Mrs. Middlestadt, Professor Middlestadt, to hand out to you. That copy is just for you to look at and go through on your own time or while I'm speaking, and just to see, whatever, while I'm speaking you can also do it. And it's just for you to get an idea of a general basis of what you would see in the peonage files. These are all printouts that I used while working on my paper of the peonage files. And basically what the peonage files mainly consist of are records of memos and telegrams back and forth between lawyers and other judicial officials, sometimes even congressmen. Besides that, they had newspaper clippings, and they also had one thing which I used for my paper was an article written by an investigator for a magazine. And and the one other thing the debt peonage files had was the letters. Now, there's not as many as I would have liked, but every now and then you came across the handwritten letters of either African Americans who were in peonage themselves or relatives appealing to the judiciary, the federal government, to try and help their relatives or them themselves in peonage. The secondary sources I used were, there was actually 3 or 4, but really 2 main books that I used. Number 1 was recommended to me by Professor Middlestadt, Slavery by Another Name, and the other one is The Shadow of Slavery. In Slavery by Another Name, Douglas Blackman, who's really not a historian, he's a Wall Street Journal editor, but he portrays the horrific trauma that African Americans went through in debt peonage. That horrific trauma consisted of, they were working as sharecroppers, and on their way home to their families, someone who was usually in cahoots with a plantation owner, so in other words this whole thing's a farce, he would go and accuse this African American of owing him money, and then the African American either didn't have money to pay him or he refused, and the next thing he knows, he's being fined by the courts. A lot of times it wasn't an official court, there was no official jury, it was just a mayor or a councilman who they set up a farce of a trial, and they fined this, they said, okay, $35, then there would be the, you owe him $35, $50, then they would have the plantation owner, someone like one of the people that Blackman mentions is a guy named John Pace. John Davis was one of his African American victims, and he would pay off the supposed debt, and now this African American had to work off in a turpentine farm or some other plantation, or even the worst of them was the coal mines, would have to work off this debt. The other book is this, and that's not the complete summation of Blackman's book, but that one story is a general idea of one of the main things Blackman was trying to bring home, which is the horror and trauma that this system of peonage caused to African Americans. The other one is The Shadow of Slavery, which is more documentary based, and it basically discusses and explains the system of peonage. However, my paper was really, and the thesis of my paper was to show how the peonage files is evidence that African Americans didn't go like sheep to the slaughter to this system. They resisted it. If you look at the end of that packet, one of the letters I attached was by a guy named Oliver Guy. Guy would not be the right word to use that. Oliver Guy was his name, and he wrote a letter. It's one of the few letters I found in the peonage files where he's complaining. He's saying, "Me and my friends are stuck here in peonage, and it's against which is against the laws of the United States." And the idea was he was appealing to the federal government to send someone to investigate and release him. You also find in the peonage files, I found two letters that were written to the President of the United States, making the same thing, an appeal. One was a letter of a woman who had a black woman who was the caretaker of her deaf nephew, and she entrusted him to a Southern, which I write in my paper that probably most black people didn't do. They probably were more aware of what would happen if you did this, but she made this mistake, and he took her nephew and put him in peonage. And the other was a letter, actually, which is another discussion. In the peonage files, a lot of times the trial can never fully go through because the witnesses ran away. And why did the witnesses run away? Because sometimes the witnesses were the ones who wrote the letters. The reason they ran away is because they wrote the letters they were stuck in peonage and they wanted out. Once the investigators came down there, and usually, sometimes the plantation owners themselves would free them and threaten them to basically run out of the area. And they saw that, I think, as a more viable option to obtaining freedom than staying in court and trying to seek their oppressor's punishment. However, there was a woman who wrote to the president demanding that she was a victim of peonage, and her oppressors were never punished. And she writes the president asking him to direct her to the right department to make sure that these people who hurt her were sufficiently punished. In many cases, it never happened. And the reason it never happened, which is really evident in the peonage files, is that prosecutors and lawyers knew that there was only so far they could push with these cases. There's an example of one of the files where Mr. Hoyt was subpoenaed to go somewhere else. It's for the same thing, a case of peonage, but he was already involved in a case in Tampa, Florida. And the reason, my speculation is the reason that, from other things I read, the reason he was subpoenaed and sent elsewhere is to break up the work he was doing. They realized that the Southerners would only allow the federal government to interfere so far in trying to grant black people more rights and more freedom and equality. And basically, what I mentioned, because I know my YouTube time is probably running out, I hope I presented you with a basic idea of peonage. Let me just review some of the basic ideas. Number one is that the federal government did attempt to stop peonage. Probably the first attempt was with the 13th Amendment. Then they had the peonage statute, a statute by Congress passed in 1867, which also directly outlawed peonage. And what's interesting is, from 1865 to 1901, you never hear of any cases, but in 1901, you see through the peonage files that the federal government once again was heavily trying to prosecute cases of peonage. So the federal government did try and interfere, but they only could go so far. You have to remember, the Civil War is fresh in many people's minds, and therefore I guess they were afraid of possibly inflicting too much of a negative opinion on Southerns that they would actually want to rebel against. That's maybe a far assumption, but that's point one. Point number two to remember is that African Americans did resist peonage. They didn't accept it. You know, I don't know enough about slavery history. My impression is that African Americans, obviously the runaways didn't accept it, but there was very little room for them to work with. Here in the 1900s and even in the 19th century, the African Americans had the 13th Amendment and other laws to grant them more rights, and they tried to the best of their ability to demand that those rights would be given to them. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be until the civil rights in the 1960 that we would actually see that take fruit in a much greater way. Anyway, I kind of didn't have a teleprompter or a script to read off of, so I apologize if this was disorganized. I was also pressed for time because Sunday night starts Passover and I have to get this on YouTube by then. I hope I taught you something about Peonage and the papers that I gave you. Please feel free to look through and get a better idea of Peonage. Thank you very much, Michal. Hit the button. Does that say it, huh?